skip a few paragraphs on to the next page. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. So now what is virtue? Now, the virtue we skip a little ways, the virtue we must study is human virtue, for the good we are seeking was human good and the happiness human happiness. Now some people say all you really need to live is bread and water. Now Aristotle's rejecting that, saying that humans are of a different sort than animals, and they live on a different level, and they have different feelings, and happiness is a feeling unique to humans. And so you don't just want the life that will keep your heart beating. You want the life of a human. You can't just say, well, at least I'm alive. Sometimes it's not worth being alive if you're not living the life of a human. Alright, let's continue. By human virtue we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul. And happiness also we call an activity of the soul. Pause there. Now that is another rejection of hedonism. Earlier on he said something that some people might have mistaken as hedonism, which I explained wasn't. And here again, he says it's not a happiness of the body, it's a happiness of the soul. And happiness also we call an activity of the soul. I think we would call it the result of activities in the soul. But it's not hedonism, right? To say that the body is not the question. Pleasure of the body isn't the essential question. It's pleasure of the soul. And pleasure of the body has to play a role in that, but it cannot be the key central figure. So hedonism is out. Okay, so we skip a paragraph and a half. One element in the soul is irrational, and one has a rational principle. There's two parts to the soul, the rational and the irrational. This is not Freud. He's much better off than that. Hold on. Of the irrational element, one division seems to be widely distributed and vegetative in its nature. We'll get to it. I mean that which causes nutrition and growth. So he says your body, and just like the fact that you eat food and it digests, your heart beats, you breathe in, blood gets carried through your, oxygen gets carried through your blood. All these are automatic. He calls them vegetative and nutrition, nutritious growth and vegetative growth. For it is this kind of power of the soul that one must assign to all nurslings and to embryos, and the same power to full-grown creatures. So everybody has that power, that irrational. He calls that irrational. Now it doesn't mean unreasonable, he just means non-reasonable. Like I said, he's not Freud. We skip a sentence. Now the excellence of this seems to be common to all species, and not specifically human, for this part of faculty seems to function most in sleep, while goodness and badness are least manifest in sleep. Right? So you do growing and digesting, and you rest and you regenerate and stuff during sleep, but there aren't really any choices about what's good and bad while you're asleep. So he says this part of the irrational part of the body, this irrational aspect of the body, has to be set to the side and ignored as far as questions of happiness and goodness and choice and morality and so on. He says and this leads to the saying that the happy are no better off than the wretched for half of their lives, right? Because everybody sleeps sometimes, so you're happy when you're awake, but we all go to sleep, and then everybody's happy when you're asleep, or not happy, not suffering or whatever. When you're asleep, you're asleep. He says, and this happens naturally enough, since sleep is an inactivity of the soul in that respect in which it is called good or bad. Now remember, he keeps saying that happiness is an activity of the soul, and I think more precisely it comes from activity of the soul. It's very closely tied to activity. Happiness can only be gotten through activity of the soul. So when he says that sleep is inactivity of the soul, it takes it out as being part of the equation, or anything interesting enough to mention. Enough of this subject, however. Let us leave the nutritive faculty alone, since it has by its nature no share in human excellence. There seems, and now I've cut the heck out of that. We just looked at his interesting, powerful reasoning. I spare you all the deeper details. You can get and read into it. I mean, The logic and stuff is sometimes interesting, subtle, well argued, but sometimes, I mean, here we've just gone over why the vegetative and nutritive part of the body is not involved in virtue and excellence. I mean, we could have said it in a sentence, I think, maybe, but he wouldn't leave it at that. Okay. There seems to be also another irrational element in the soul, besides the nutritive one. One which, in a sense, however, shares in a rational principle. So it's irrational, but it does have part of a rational principle in its nature. There is found also another element naturally opposed to the rational principle, which fights against and resists the rational principle. For exactly as paralyzed limbs, when we intend to move them to the right, turn to the contrary to the left, so it is with the soul. Okay, so you have your desires, you have what you want to do, but there's a part in your soul that fights and makes you want to go the other way. It's a little guy with horns sitting on your shoulder. The impulses of incontinent people move in contrary directions. But while in the body we see that which moves astray, in the soul we do not. Right? If we have a paralyzed limb and we try to move it to the left and it flops over to the right, you can see that. But you don't see the functions in your soul when that happens. No doubt, however, we must nonetheless suppose that in the soul also there is something contrary to the rational principle, resisting and opposing it. Now, even this seems to have a share in a rational principle, so it's not even entirely irrational. What the hell is he talking about? Let's concretize it. Okay, at any rate, in the continent man, it obeys the rational principle. See, so it's not always irrational. Whatever he's talking about, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second, won't we, is not completely irrational in a man who is continent, whole, integrated, as it were. And presumably in the temperate and brave man it is still more obedient, for in him it speaks on all matters with the same voice as the rational principle. So there's something out there that in some people, in incontinent people, goes against rationality, clashes with it, but which rational men, brave men, courageous men, or whatever, they've gotten that under control, and it goes with the rational principle. It obeys the rational principle. Therefore, the irrational element also appears to be twofold. For the vegetative element in no way shares in a rational principle. So there's an irrational element, part of which is in our emotions and part of which is our vegetative nature. In no way shares in a rational principle, but the appetitive, that's the other rational one, the appetitive and in general the desiring element of irrationality, in a sense shares in it insofar as it listens to and obeys it. That the irrational element is in some sense persuaded by a rational principle is indicated also by the giving of advice and by all reproof and exhortation. Now I thought about that, and I guess it makes, I don't know, it doesn't sound truly profound to me. Maybe it's true. Listen to this, that the irrational element is in some sense persuaded by a rational principle. In other words, rationality has the upper hand. This fact is indicated by the giving of advice and by reproof and exhortation. Giving of advice? Okay, take it home if you like. Now before we go on, I do want to skip back to a few sentences back. We must nonetheless suppose that in the soul also there is something contrary to the rational principle. Now, what is that? He's given it to us to a fair extent, but I think that let's hammer it down a little bit, probably closer than Aristotle did, I don't know. The thing that resists the rational principle, according to Ayn Rand, according to her philosophy, the thing that resists the rational principle is the difficulty of focusing. Rationality requires effort. It requires focus. It requires mental sweat. It's difficult. It's much easier to not focus. It doesn't lead to happiness, and it often leads to a heck of a lot more pain and anguish later, but you're talking about the energy and the effort you have to put in this very instant. And a lot of people just choose to say, I'm not going to put any effort in. I'm not going to think about it. I don't care. I'm not going to put my mind to it. So that's what resists the rational principle, is inertia, the non-wanting to move of your mind, the heaviness of your mind. Put it in motion.